Hello, and welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. Today's lecture, Understanding Common Fallacies. So today we're going to be talking about how thinking can go wrong. We've spent a lot of time on how to think well, but now we're at that point when we need to look at how thinking can go awry and dig into the specifics of that. So we're going to be looking today at common fallacies. Specifically, we're going to be going over a brief introduction to what fallacies are. We're going to look at formal fallacies, informal fallacies, common informal fallacies, and then finally, troubleshoot ways that we can identify informal fallacies when they crop up in our lives. So for our purposes, we can call a formal or informal fallacy, or just a fallacy in general. The way we'll define it is that a fallacy represents a critical flaw in reasoning that can significantly undermine the strength of an argument. Fallacies often lead to misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and misleading conclusions, which can distort the truth and hinder effective communication. Understanding fallacies is essential for anyone looking to engage in rational discourse, as they can easily derail discussions and create confusion. So that's our high-level definition of what fallacies are. At a lower level, we're just going to simply think of fallacies as really poor thinking. In that sense, they are the opposite of critical thinking. They're what happens when critical thinking breaks down. And fallacies are defined as such because they're so common. They crop up. They crop up quite often, so much so that they do crop up. They crop up so often that we've actually been able to identify their patterns and analyze them. So a close cousin to the fallacies, which we will be discussing in the next lecture, is cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are just ways that our minds tend to default in specific ways. Very, very similar in kind to fallacies, but a little bit different. So we're going to devote a lot of time to that in the next lecture. That kind of gets us from the plane of logic over to the plane of psychology, even though they both end up in the same place, which is poor thinking and results that we don't really want often. So as I suggested, there are two kinds of fallacies that we'll be looking at. We'll be focusing specifically on informal fallacies. So whenever I talk about fallacies, I typically have them in mind. Formal fallacies are fallacies that implicate the structure or the logic of our thinking. And then informal fallacies implicate the content of our thinking. The latter of which is the overwhelming majority of the times when we do think poorly. So we'll focus on those specifically. So we'll touch a little bit on formal fallacies just for to be as thorough as possible. So as I said, formal fallacies are just kinds of structural errors that happen in the logic of our thinking. And so the best way to look at what a formal fallacy is and how they crop up is by looking, of course, at examples. And so previously in the series, we looked at a very strong deductive argument. And the argument that I gave you was that all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is deductive. It's guaranteed to be true if the premises are true. However, if we flip the logic and we make a misstep, what we get is what is known as a formal error of reasoning is affirming the consequent. So here we have an example. If it rained, then the ground is wet. The ground is wet, and so that's the consequent of the term in one. Therefore, it rained. So we have the antecedent and the consequent and the causal. We have the causal connection between if it rained, then the ground is wet. And what we're doing is affirming the consequent in that sentence, in that proposition, instead of the antecedent. And this is identified as a formal fallacy. It's illogical, and it results in a conclusion that isn't necessarily true, if true at all. And so we can think about, well, why is that true, or is that true? So if it rained, then the ground is wet. Is it necessarily true that if the ground is wet, then it must have rained? Can there be other reasons why the ground is wet? Of course there can. We talked about this previously as well. The sprinkler system could have gone off. We could have dropped our big gulp on the sidewalk, etc. There's several reasons why. However, it's more likely that if it rained, then the ground will be wet. Of course, we might need to be specific on what kind of ground is wet, because if we have covered ground, then that ground's not going to be wet, you see. However, generally speaking, it is true that if it rained, the ground is going to be wet. So affirming the consequent is a kind of formal fallacy that crops up. Like I said, we're not going to spend too much time on this because this really gets us into the realm of logic, which is great, but we're really focused on the tools for critical thinking. And so we want to focus on the common fallacies. So what are informal fallacies? I've already suggested a little bit here, but I'm going to read the definition to be as pedantic and thorough as possible. So informal fallacies are errors in reasoning that arise not from the structural form of an argument, but from issues related to its content or context. These fallacies can lead to flawed conclusions and miscommunication, as they often stem from incorrect assumptions, irrelevant information, or improper use of language. In the end of the last sentence there, we had a trichotomy. We had incorrect assumptions, irrelevant information, and improper use of language. And I would like to focus a little bit on those three topics. So how do informal fallacies, generally speaking, crop up? So first, they happen from our assumptions, from the assumptions we make. So oftentimes when we have a conversation with someone or encounter media or what have you, we come with a certain set of assumptions about the way the world works. In fact, we need these assumptions in order to operate in the world. We have to have some set of beliefs in order to act on those beliefs, whether or not those beliefs are accurately representing the way the world is or not. And so when I have a conversation with someone and I'm talking on some topic A, I might have certain assumptions about that topic that don't actually reflect reality or are not relevant to the conversation at hand. And then we'll effectively be talking past each other. So in this instance, what we have is false assumptions being made about the topic, and then we're not able to communicate accurately with one another. Okay, so a concrete example, and we will get into the concrete common fallacies here, but for instance, if I'm having a conversation with someone and I make the assumption that perhaps they don't know what they're speaking about, I will make the claim, of course, that, well, I can't really trust this person's testimony because they're not an expert in the field. This is an assumption that I'm making. And from that assumption, I'm drawing the conclusion that their testimony is not trustworthy. Now, skepticism is called for, generally speaking, but in this instance, maybe the person that I'm conversing with or listening to is an expert in their field. Meaning my assumption has led me to ad hominem. We are skewing, our assumption about the person is skewing the reliability of their testimony, or at least my ability to trust that testimony. And so I'm attacking something about the quality of this person rather than appreciating what it is they're saying. So another way that common fallacies crop up is through relevance and misdirection. So relevance and misdirection happens when we are subtly shifting the topic on hand enough to kind of masquerade what it is we're talking about as something else, or simply talking about something that's not relevant to the topic at hand. And when that happens, what results, of course, is misdirection. We're talking about something, we're talking about something that isn't actually relevant to the conversation. And so this happens a lot in political discourse in what is known as the straw man fallacy. And so we'll rely on a false representation of someone's position and then proceed to attack that position, the position of which, of course, has no bearing on the actual topic. And so it's irrelevant. And so everything that I critique after the fact, of course, is also irrelevant to the topic because I'm not talking about the topic. I've misdirected myself and my listeners to focus on something that isn't couched in the truth. And so that's an instance of relevance and misdirection. And then finally, ways that fallacies crop up in day-to-day conversation or discourse is through the misuse of language. And this can happen quite a lot. And so there's two ways that this might happen. It can happen, there's more than two ways, but there's two ways that we can look at. One is the use of false dichotomies, and the other is in the use of ambiguity or vagueness. And so one way that we can misuse language is by presenting a problem as being either A or B and nothing in between, when that's not necessarily the case. So it is the case that sometimes we have situations where A and B are exclusive. So for example, if I say the store is either opened or closed, this is not a false dichotomy. This is true. If there is a store, it will either be opened or it will be closed. There's not much in between. However, it's not true. That logic doesn't apply now to the claim that you can either have ice cream or you can have cookies. We can think of a middle ground. You can have an ice cream sandwich, which is wonderful. So what I've presented here is a false dichotomy. Now, of course, you can imagine with more context that the parent is saying you can either have ice cream or a cookie, but you can't have both. All right, well, now we have more information, we have more context, and we understand that this choice is, in fact, an exclusive or versus an inclusive or. So that's one way that language can create a sense of dichotomy that isn't logically there. Another way, of course, is in the use of ambiguity or vagueness. And ambiguity and vagueness are very closely related. So I'll just define them just to help us along. So ambiguity in language arises when a term can have a countable number of definitions. So if I say communism, for instance, well, that's not a great example because communism is actually very vague. So think of a definition of some kind where it could be A, B, or C, but I need to define it. I need to be precise. Oh, I mean this specifically. Vagueness, on the other hand, is when there is an uncountable number of definitions that can go along with a term. Something like communism, in fact. We don't get very far when we use that term. In fact, we don't get really far at all when we use isms of any kind. Existentialism, communism, prescriptivism, whatever it is. Isms are typically a way of masking precision and understanding and introducing vagueness into a conversation. And so whenever we rely on ambiguity or vagueness in an argument, either implicitly or explicitly, what we end up doing is what is known as equivocation. We might end up shifting the definition. I might be, for instance, talking about one form of existentialism or prescriptionism, and then change the definition without letting you know. And then, of course, we're not talking about the same things anymore. Or, well, I'm not talking about the same things anymore. And so then you're not able to follow, and nor does the logical entailment and my argument follow anymore because the premises and the definitions have changed. So that's kind of messy, right? It's messy. And so the antidote to that, of course, is to be as precise as possible in our definitions. So define what it is we're talking about, and then, of course, stick to those definitions. So those are three ways that fallacies can crop up in our language today. We're now going to jump into tons of common fallacies. There's dozens of them, in fact. So we're only going to focus on a few because we have limited time. So the first common informal fallacy, henceforth fallacies, that I want to talk about is ad hominem. This is a cool Latin word you can use. You can bring it up at a party and you'll look cool or you'll look like a nerd. Your mileage may vary. I don't know your friends. But an ad hominem is Latin for against the man or against the human. Say it's a neutral term, ad hominem. And it means when we attack someone in conversation. And so this is a instance of false assumption, as we talked about. So an ad hominem fallacy is simply when we attack someone and their credibility rather than focusing on their arguments. And so a sort of high level or highbrow example of an ad hominem fallacy would be, you can't trust her opinion on renewable energy. She's never worked in the energy sector. This is an attack on the person's credibility, not on the argument that this person may have presented. And so it is a classical form of ad hominem. Just because a person hasn't worked in a specific sector, it doesn't follow that they might not be an expert on the topic. And so we have to proceed with caution when we reason like this, or maybe we ought not to reason like this at all anyways. So you can't trust her opinion on renewable energy because she hasn't worked in the energy sector. However, you don't only have to work in the energy sector per se in order to understand what renewable energy is. So you could be an expert on renewable energy and work in natural resources. You could work in park and recreation. You could be a professor, and so you have a high theoretical understanding of energy. It's not that you have to be working specifically in the energy sector in order to be an expert. So what we have here is a conflation of expertise. It's a lack of nuance in our thinking, and it's false assumptions that lead us to conclusions, not even to conclusions, but to attack a person when it's unwarranted. More evidence. So it might be true, by the way, it might be true that this person is not an expert. However, the burden is on me to demonstrate that. It's not sufficient for me to attack someone. I have to show using reasons why this person isn't an expert. So a more lowbrow example of an ad hominem, and I just bring this up for you to be able to remember it, is basically if you find yourself or you find someone, hopefully it's not you, if you find someone or encounter someone saying something like, you can't trust X because X is an idiot, something like this, this is a kind of ad hominem fallacy. Unfortunately, I bring up the lowbrow version of this because we encounter it a lot in this day and age. So that's an ad hominem fallacy. Next is a straw man fallacy. So the straw man fallacy is a pervasive tactic used in arguments where an individual's position is misrepresented or oversimplified to make it easier to refute. So an example would be person A wants to shut down all factories, which would ruin our economy. So for the sake of argument, let's assume that person A does want to shut down factories, but it's not the case that person A wants to shut down all the factories. What we have here is a rhetorical use of hyperbole. We've made one claim, which is, I would like to close down some factories. I've used hyperbole and said this person wants to close down all factories. Well, this isn't true. And to say some versus all is a big difference. There's a big difference between closing some factories and closing all factories. And so when I misrepresent person A's position by saying they want to close all factories, I'm now arguing and advocating or disadvocating, if that's a word, for a position that isn't accurate. It's not couched in reality at all. However, I'm able to use my rhetorical devices or my emotional appeals in order to persuade you or to sneak in that idea. If we assume that person A wants to use all of them, now we can proceed to attack why that would be a horrible idea. And so maybe I go down the road and show how closing all these factories would be catastrophic to the economy, and here's why, and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because person A never said that. It's not reality at all. Unfortunately, we see this a lot in political discourse. It's very easy to say the past administration did this or did that, and therefore they're wrong, without being very clear as to why or what the previous administration's position was on the topic, which is actually probably very complicated and very nuanced and probably won't take 5 minutes to explain. So what's important to keep in mind, of course, is a straw man fallacy is effectively setting up a straw man, a fake person, and then attacking that person because that person, the straw man, is easier to attack than the real person. Because attacking the real person takes nuance, it takes understanding, it takes charity, and of course it takes healthy skepticism, all of which we've talked about previously. The burden is on me to show why is it bad for our economy, in this case, to close down some of the factories. And maybe there actually is good reasons for closing down some of the factories. Maybe we need to use those resources to bolster staff at the factories that are operating well, etc. But that's a whole nuanced conversation that I, maybe as a political opponent, don't want to get into. And so I'll effectively lie about your position to attack it. That's easier. It's the subtle things. And fallacies, I'll just say, fallacies crop up for at least two different reasons. Either we're not thinking critically, and so we make a mistake, We're not being precise. Language is slippery. It's tricky. We're proficient as language users, but we're not maybe experts at language. And so we make mistakes. And then we get the more unfortunate use of fallacies where they're used intentionally to misdirect, or they're used out of anger. And this is really unfortunate because not only is it fallacious, it's untrue, it also shows a good deal of disrespect to the people receiving the arguments or receiving the information, because it's communicating to them that you're not rational enough or able enough, and maybe that's true, to actually appreciate the nuance of the conversation. Effectively, when I use fallacies intentionally, I'm saying to you, you're not of the level of me to participate critically in the conversation. So instead, I'm going to tell you how you ought to think. This kind of approach is kind of information authoritarian approach that is kind of anti-critical thinking, is something that I personally am very, very, very against, and I try to actively combat. So the next fallacy that we have is the slippery slope fallacy. This fallacy is very slippery. It's very easy to use. It's very easy to fall into, and it as well is very pervasive. So the slippery slope fallacy is a logical misstep that occurs when one assumes that a particular action will inevitably lead to a series of negative, maybe even catastrophic consequences without the person making the fallacy or committing the fallacy providing adequate evidence to support a claim. So, for example, if we let students redo assignments, soon they will expect to retake all of the assignments, and therefore they'll never learn responsibility. Basically, what we have here is a snowball effect. We have some little thing that happens, and then it runs away from us, and suddenly it's this massive problem, and it's catastrophic, and everybody's going to die, the economy is going to crash, and no one's going to know what to do, just because some student A needed to redo assignment. Well, we have to hit the brakes here, folks, because it's up to us, the person making the argument, to demonstrate that this catastrophic outcome is, in fact, logically, causally, and systematically going to unfold from opening up an assignment in this example. And I haven't done that. What I've given you is A and Z without giving you all the letters that connect that series of events. And so either my conclusion won't follow, there won't be a catastrophic outcome, and so I have a problem of entailment, it's just false, or I've hidden so many of my premises of my argument that you're not able to follow or to participate. And yet I've given this reasoning enough to allow you to fill in. I mean, we're humans, and so we're going to try to fill in the inference and say, oh, I can imagine that, and I'll do the work myself, but I won't be able to do it in a way that's clear and accurate to the topic at hand. And so what we have, of course, is the slippery slope fallacy. To give you a more concrete personal example, I was recently trimming my beard, and the trimmer fell off of, the head of my trimmer fell off and went under my washer. So I have a washer and dryer that stack, and while I am a strapping young man, I'm not strong enough to move them on my own. And so I couldn't get the trimmer head on my own. And so I did what any reasonable person would do, I think, which is to go and consult maintenance. And I said, hey, can you, move these washer and dryer so I can get my trimmer head? I don't want to buy another one. It works. It just fell under the thing. And the person committed a slippery slope fallacy. They said, well, first they said, no, we actually can't do that. That doesn't fall under the purview of maintenance because nothing's broke. And I was like, okay, well, in my head, I'm thinking, well, I can tear the washer and dryer apart and then something will be broke. But I didn't say that. I was just grumpy, so I thought it. Then they said, well, also, if I were to help you to get the trimmer head, then I'd have to help everybody to get it. This is ridiculous. One, not everybody uses trimmer heads in the building. Two, not everyone's going to lose them under the washer like me. I'm the idiot, not everybody. Three, it doesn't follow, or it's not clear to me how if you helped me to get my trimmer head from under the washer, you'd have to do that for everybody in the building. And so what we have is this catastrophic snowballing effect where the maintenance man would unfortunately have to do his job for everybody, in my opinion. See, I'm being grumpy. They would have to do their job for everybody in the building instead of, just not doing anything at all. And so the person in this instance was committing a slippery slope fallacy. And the pedantic professor in my mind was like, maybe I ought to go down there and educate them on, fallacious reasoning. And instead, I got on Amazon and I bought another trimmer head. So if you ever move into my unit, you might find a trimmer head under the washer. But that's an example of a slippery slope fallacy, and when and how to pick your battles. Very good. Moving right along. So again, we talked a little bit about the false dichotomy. So we'll review that briefly. So a false dichotomy, also known as a false choice fallacy, occurs when an argument presents a situation as having only two possible options or outcomes, while in reality, more alternatives might exist. So, highbrow example here, we either need to switch completely to renewable energy sources or we will face catastrophic climate change. We have a little bit of a slippery slope here too, right? We have this kind of catastrophe thinking, this catastrophic reasoning that might not be warranted. But in this instance, we have to either switch over to renewable energy or suffer gravely. But there could be a middle ground. It doesn't have to be either or. We could use, for instance, a mixed portfolio of energy sources that meet our energy needs and still result in a healthy climate or an improved climate. And so by presenting it in this either or format, I'm misusing either intentionally or unintentionally my grammar. I'm using an either or construction that is simply incorrect. And so I need to be a little bit more nuanced in my approach. Anyways, so false dichotomies. The key to remember is there a middle ground? Is there a third way? If not, if there isn't a middle way, what I actually have is not a false dichotomy, but what is known in logic as a Horn dilemma. Either you have A or B. Both instances in this instance as a Horn dilemma, both instances would be not favorable outcomes. And so you kind of get stuck on a horn. And that can be a very classic form of argumentation in logic that's very effective. Either you have a bad outcome A or bad outcome B, and you have to pick the lesser of two evils. But you want to check for a middle way to break down the Horn dilemma and say, well, actually, it's not a Horn dilemma at all. It's a false dichotomy. Here's a middle road. Here's a more nuanced way of thinking about the problem that you're presenting. And then finally, appeal to authority. So an appeal to authority happens when an argument is based on the opinion of an authority figure or a perceived authority figure rather than substantive evidence. So unpacking the fallacy of an appeal to authority takes a little nuance here. Sometimes we appeal to authority in a way that's inappropriate. So for example, if I'm interested in a new skincare routine and I notice that the drummer of my favorite band, Blink-182, Travis Barker, has a new skincare product line, I might think to myself, oh, well, Travis Barker he's an authority figure. He's a celebrity. So of course, any skincare product he comes out with is going to be amazing. However, he's an inappropriate person to appeal to as an authority on skincare because he's not an expert on skincare. He's an expert on drumming. He's an amazing drummer. However, the claim that's being made is something about skincare. And so his authority, his expertise don't match with what's being presented to me. However, this happens all the time. We appeal to authority figures that aren't appropriate authority figures at all for the topic at hand. However, that doesn't mean that we don't appeal to authority figures at all. So what we absolutely want to do is appeal to not authorities, and I bring this up just as a way to distinguish the two, but experts. We want to appeal to experts. We want to appeal to experts that are experts in the things that we're speaking about directly. And so instead of appealing to Travis Barker and his expertise on drumming, in this example, what I would like to do or what I need to do is to appeal to maybe a dermatologist who has gone to school and spent a lot of time thinking about types of skin and the way it reacts to different products. That would be an appropriate appeal to authority. To distinguish the two, I like to think of that as an appeal to expertise. Now, that doesn't mean that experts don't make mistakes. We still have to proceed with charity, but also skepticism. It can still be the case that an expert makes a misstep. And so it's up to us to make sure that that expert is thinking critically and that we're able to think through their thinking to proof it and make sure that it's accurate. We can test the hypotheses, we can test the premises, we can test the way that the person's drawing conclusions, etc. But because they're an expert, they're far more credible than someone that is touted as a authority figure of some kind, but doesn't actually have any relevance to the topic at hand. So finally, we can talk a little bit about, well, how do we spot fallacies when they crop up in conversation or in day-to-day life? Recognizing fallacies in everyday context is a crucial skill that enhances logical and critical thinking. They often happen in specific case scenarios. They'll happen in discussions, so they'll happen in conversations that we'll have. They often happen in adverts or in advertisements. And then, of course, they'll happen in media. Now we'll look at how to spot these fallacies in these three areas. So in discussion formats, in media formats, and also in adverts, and also in political discourse. And so in discussions, it's important to remember that one way to avoid fallacies and to spot them, of course, is to ask yourself if you're proceeding or starting off from common ground. So it's really important to make sure that everyone's on the same page, we have the same definitions, and we have the same goal before we proceed to have a conversation or to try to solve a problem. Otherwise, what we will do is proceed to have a conversation on poorly defined terms, and we'll spend a good deal of time talking past each other and not really making much progress at all. And this happens a lot because having a nuanced, critical conversation in day-to-day discourse is actually quite difficult because it's time consuming, and we all know how much or how little time we have every day to ourselves. Our time is constantly being taken from us. And so it's really hard. And even we're told that it's wrong and selfish to slow down and take time for ourselves and say, no, I want to think about this slowly. I want to think about this critically. What do you mean by this? Before we even start to get into the critical part, let's get clear on what it is we're talking about. And so just bear that in mind, that there's a lot of forces that is working against this need that we have as critical thinkers, which is to slow down and take our time and to just communicate, to be human and have a conversation. Next, in advertisements. So advertisements rely a lot on fallacies. Often, as we discussed, advertisements will rely on appeals to authority that are largely uncalled for. And so they'll make appeals to expertise of people that their expertise aren't relevant. I gave the example of Travis Barker, the drummer of Blink-182. He does have a skincare line, if you want to know. He's talked about it. He's like, it's funny. He's like, I don't know anything about this. I just want a skincare routine product that does X. And of course, he talked to experts and they produce that. And now he sells it. He makes a bajillion dollars, and that's wonderful for Travis Barker. But nevertheless, it's very common in advertisements to have what is known as celebrity endorsements. For instance, for perfumes and things, if you want to smell wonderful, you have to smell like Ariana Grande or Lady Gaga. Do you really want to smell like them? Think about that. I don't know. Maybe you don't want to smell like them, right? But it happens a lot in advertisements. Something else that happens a lot, we didn't talk about this fallacy, is an appeal to emotion. So advertisements often appeal to your emotions in some way. So often advertisements are time boxed. They only have so much time, and so they have to work not logically or critically, but rhetorically in order to get you to bite. And one way to do that, of course, is to appeal to your emotions. So to give you an example, if you open a beauty magazine or something like this, and the advert is trying to quickly convince you that you are ugly and deficient in some way, or you'll never get a partner because you're too short, or whatever, and if you buy these platform shoes or these shoe risers, I don't know, I'm making this up, then you'll finally be a whole person and you'll have all the partners in the world and you'll be the king of the world. This is largely an emotional appeal. There's no logic or evidence being presented at all. Maybe it's true, but you're certainly not being invited to participate in that. Instead, you're being manipulated to feel a particular way, which is bad. You're being manipulated to feel horrible and then given by the advert the solution that you never realized you needed for a problem you didn't even know you had, and then just buy this and your woes will be whisked away. This is what is known as an appeal to emotion, and it's rude, and it's fallacious. And it happens a lot in advertisements. So generally speaking, be very leery of advertisements. Their primary goal is not to help you, it's to make money. That's it. Or was that a false dichotomy? I don't know. And then finally, of course, politics. So much like advertisements, politics rely a lot on, honestly, just skewing information or representing or presenting information in a way that is inaccurate. And so what we get is a lot of straw man arguments, so misrepresenting political positions or politicians in general in a way that doesn't accurately represent them, and then proceeding to attack that false representation, or of course presenting often catastrophic, emotionally scary situations in a way that are dichotomous. So it's either A or B, or it's the end of the world. When what's called for is to slow down, to get a lot more precise, and to search for middle grounds. Again, for politics in general is just, it's such a morass. It's so hard to navigate. Because once you start talking at the political level, you're talking at the social level. You're talking about what is best for the body politic, the polos, right? Which is the city in Greek. The polos are the city. And so you're talking about what's generally speaking good for everyone. Just think about all the assumptions that have to go into that before you can make an accurate political claim. You have to have a theory of what it means to live the good life, how that applies to so many people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to know about your demographic and all this. It's extremely complex. And so by the time you start making political assertions, you're carrying so much theoretical baggage that it would take forever to really be clear about your political position in a way that is charitable and generous to the person you're trying to convince. And so it's simply easier to misrepresent and to masquerade politically. And it happens quite a bit, if not all the time. And of course, we effectively live in an age now where political honesty, if you will, is so rare that many of us actually don't know what the truth amounts to anymore when it comes to political discourse. We kind of live in a post-truth society where we've been fed, misrepresentation so much that we actually think misrepresentation in general is the truth, and that there isn't anything such as the truth. Everything is relative, and everything is just kind of thrown up in the air. And that's a horrible place to be, folks. It is my belief and my view that there is such thing as the truth, and it is worth fighting for. And critical thinking is the way to uncover it, to find it, and to hold on to it. But there's a lot of fallacies being used in the world that works against that. So now, as always, I'd like to leave you with a few reflection questions. So first, while it's maybe clearer how to apply what you've learned about informal fallacies, how might you apply what you've learned about formal fallacies? Next, think of a time when you were consuming media of some type recently. Do you recall any fallacies appearing in the content? And then finally, how might you develop the ability to identify fallacies in your own life? So next week, we're going to be looking at the informal fallacies, awkward cousin, which are the cognitive biases. So stay tuned, and I will see you next time.